Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Other Side Extra, our no-frills, low-budget production chats that we have with very esteemed and special guests every week, or whenever we feel like doing it. But at the moment, because of the Queensland election, we are popping one up every week. And I'm very happy. We are going to be talking about the Queensland state election again this time, but I'm very happy to have two very highly esteemed guests, Dan PETRIE, former journalist with Bloomberg and also with News Corporation at the Sunday Mail in Brisbane, and SCOTT PRASSER, Dr. SCOTT PRASSER, who's been the author of many books about government and leadership. Scott, I also understand you've been on the other side before, but you also worked at a very high level in the federal government. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, I was senior advisor to three cabinet ministers, Christopher Pyne, Simon Birmingham, and Bridget McKenzie. So the first two, education, next one was regional health and those sort of issues.
Just an overall, how do you feel about this election campaign as opposed to election campaigns that we've seen in the past in terms of the performance of the parties and the leaders?
Well, I think the Premier is actually better on the stumps than I think Christopher Foley. Christopher Foley seems to be quite nervous when he actually has got a lot of things going for the LNP campaign. The LNP are sticking to a very narrow script, the 4 issues or 5 issues. I got a message today from the local LNP candidate in the electorate I'm in. It was the same old, the same things. So the LNP are sticking to this script, and the ALP are trying to make us forget some of the mistakes they've made and keep announcing new things, new spending things. No one wants to talk about really how we're going to pay for all this, which is really unusual election. Normally the government's the one trying to nail down the opposition, but both sides are sort of missing in action on trying to explain what all this means. We had the Shadow Treasurer on 4BC and ABC this week for the first time, and it was a fairly average performance in him trying to explain how they're going to roll back the budget deficit, roll back the debt, but not cut anything at all. So this is all very confusing.
Well, this is the guts of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we've got an opposition that's been terrified of being tainted for, I think now, a ridiculous length of time. I mean, it's been 8-9 years since the end of Campbell Newman's government. We saw the situation, of course, in Queensland where there were cuts made to the public service by Mr. Newman and his government. And then there was an enormous backlash to that. And the Labor Party have dined out on that and used it as a weapon to beat the LNP into submission, really, for the past 8 years and a couple of elections. And they've tried it again this time. And, of course, the LNP being the way they are these days, they don't stand up and fight. They tend to accept the framing of the other party, and then they'll just say, well, okay, we're not like that. We're not going to do that. But the weird thing is we're in a situation now where we've got $130 billion of state debt heading for $188 billion in 2027, I think is the budget estimate. And we really do need, responsible government would be, to make some cuts, right?
Yes, and that was really seen just before the state budget came down, where Christopher Foley foolishly said, we're going to agree everything in the state budget before we've seen it. I've never heard that ever before. And the LNP they are under the shadow of the Newman government. Now, we know the Newman government was sort of doing the right thing at the wrong pace, basically, and so it turned everyone off. But they've had 9 years. They should have been mounting a sort of narrative that we still got to have budget surpluses. We still got to be in the black, not in the red. We can still do things, and they could do this very simply by saying, look, we're going to have no enforced redundancies. We're just going to have attrition. We're going to quarantine some areas off so that we don't cut some essential or very important frontline services. And we need to come to grips. And also, I'm a great believer that parties should come clean with the electorate about what they're going to do about things. So there's no surprises on the Sunday morning afterwards, if you like. Okay. So we had the big win on Saturday night. Well, okay, Shadow Treasurer, you're meeting your officials on Sunday morning. what's going to happen? What's the game going to be in? So that's what I think. It's been pretty poor. The other issue, which I'm sure Dan might talk about as well, is it seems to be a Christopherly only person around. We've got the deputy leader not willing to be in a debate with the state treasurer. Where are all the other shadow ministers happening? You don't see much of them. It's very much a Christopherly game. And I think that's a pretty tricky thing to do because we want to know who all the other ministers are going to be and are they competent up the field. No one's talking about, do we really need 27 ministers? We've got 27 now. What about all those ministerial advisors, which have doubled, quadrupled under the Labor Party? Are we going to keep all those sort of positions going? What about all the public servants who've been appointed by the Labor government? Can you trust them? There's a whole range of issues we should be discussing, as well as matters like education you mentioned.
Dan, your thoughts on all of that? I mean, is this obviously a deliberate strategy we know by Christopherly to play small target, to not get into any sensitive issues, say as little as possible, but also a strategy of extreme message control in virtually, it looks like, gagging the rest of his opposition front bench?
Well, it says a lot for the depth of your front bench if they're not even prepared to get in the field. And in my lifetime, I've seen the economic debate, which was supposedly once the stronghold of the blue team, they're now too afraid to discuss it. And to Scott's point is a very good one about the fact that you've got Christopherly, he's quite a polished, I should say, media performer, David Christopherly, but by and large, though, I mean, if Ros Bates, for example, in health, and Jared Bly, who's the deputy, the opposition number 2, if they can't step up and have a debate, then you've got very serious problems. Even someone like Dev Freckington, who's more than up for the fight.
Just to put those numbers into perspective, the Queensland budget annually is usually around $70 billion. It's blown out by $9 billion. I think they're looking at almost $80 billion this fiscal year. But we also have a situation where we've got this debt of $130 billion, the interest bill on which is going to be eating up a fair slice of things. Scott, where do you think in government the most fat is? I mean, what should a new lineup of ministers and a new premier be saying to the bureaucrats on day one?
Well, look, the public service has grown dramatically in the last few years. That's the way the Labor Party has tried to, if you like, sandbag their position. If you employ a lot of public servants, they're going to vote for the government that's employed them, essentially. So the public service has grown dramatically. The biggest spending item is health. Now, health is a well that can never be filled. No matter how much you spend on health, it's never enough. Education is not too far behind, it's number 2. But you've got a lot of public service at head offices, which, you'd have to put some sort of ceiling on the public service. Now, we don't want to go down the Campbell-Newman track where there was sort of a whole stack of redundancies, empty offices all over the place. I was running workshops for that government, and it went from 35 people at a workshop to 5 people at a workshop, which is very lonely when you're running a workshop. It was very misallocated, if you like. So and the other thing we've got to do, we've got to get the public service depoliticised. 9 years of a Labor government means the upper rungs and not so upper rungs are politicised. We don't have really a apolitical public service. Now we've got, the head of the Premier's department at the moment is a former ALP politician, an ALP advisor. Come on, that's not acceptable under any circumstances, no matter how competent that person may be. The government's got to sort out what's its plan to depoliticise the public service. And we can talk about education later on, what they're going to do there.
So depoliticisation of the public service, you think, and also cost cutting, but it's hard to reduce the size of the bureaucracy when you're talking about frontline health, frontline education. They're the ones that sort of government's got to get right. But there is a lot of fat, isn't there, Dan? I think there are some statistics around about it being a sort of 2-to-1 ratio of frontline teachers and nurses to bureaucrats.
Well, that's certainly the case in the nurses' situation, where effectively now it's one bureaucrat, two nurses. I think the same ratio when you go into Europe, even in France, that becomes one bureaucrat to five nurses. And so, if France is beating you on bureaucratic
efficiency,
trim, for want of a better word, then
yes.
Again, it highlights a problem. Just coming back, if you were to look at those public service numbers, they rarely now break it down beyond their classifications. They say AO6 to AO5 to AO. Well, once you get to AO8, that's basically an admin officer or someone basically working in the office. Once it's got an S in front of it, that's a high profile and a high paying position. There's a lot of AO8s and a lot of S's now within the mix of that data. But when a wage bill is approaching 35 billion, when New Zealand, for example, achieves a lot more for a quantum of $10 billion less, and that's a country with embassies all over the world. Mind you, we have offices all over the world.
Well, and Queensland and New Zealand are about the same size population-wise, but of course, as you say, New Zealand is a country. It's got other expenses, right?
It's a sovereign nation. But the thing is, they've got two levels of government. And again, that debate, once you start talking about areas of localisation, subsidiarity, that becomes the domain of cranks and crazies, apparently. And Australia is a bizarre situation where we seem to be in love with this middle tier of government, state government. And, we talk about the blandness of this debate within, like Crucifulli and Miles both know that a large 40% of the revenue that Queensland derives from is from GST allocation, in a very bizarre mix of, fiscal, horizontal fiscal vertical integration and an acronym which becomes quite absurd. But when there's $27 billion as the crow flies, the only other lever you can pull in terms of your taxation revenue at the state level is, of course, if you're a resources state. Now, that's been done quite brutally to the resources sector, but now it's starting to manifest in other ways. There's no projects coming online. If you go to the Resources Council, ask them what projects of significant size are coming online. So that, if you look at the forward estimates, the revenue to come in is simply not there. And so Crucifulli and Miles, they can have as many debates as they want. They're arguing over the same bucket of money.
Yeah.
And the idea that people can't lose a job, or that you can't make adjustments to save money through your workforce because for some reason there's a nobility in serving the state, then you're actually doing a terrible disservice to the taxpayer. And in fact, all you're doing is really you're mopping up and crowding out that market for available skills, which could probably be deployed better in other parts of the world, but other parts of the state, I should say. But again,
we're not. I mean, Crucifulli's obviously not going to be able to deal with the debt if he doesn't make some cuts. Where is he going to cut? What is he going to cut?
The thing is, there's only. It's brutal, but this is the fact. The only way you have to look at the mix of your capability. And if you're basically producing buildings and owning buildings, then that's absurd. You either have to start leasing out government infrastructure, which, if it's not mission critical, or it can be done through the private sector, then it should be done through the private sector. Like things such as, one of the most absurd things I remember reading and in the election cycle has been the idea of Medicare being privatised. A complete and utter brain, I don't want to call it fart, but that's what it is, a brain fart, that, that all of a sudden Medicare would be privatised because the government of the day, I think it was Morrison or even Turnbull, were looking at using a different technology vendor. What, we're going to build this capability? We can't. And so you either start making efficiencies, you look what can be delivered through the private sector. The Labor Party now uses the private hospital sector to cut through waiting list times. That is enough for that party.
Yep.
And it makes, and how to argue against it's absurd.
Scott, I mean, where do you start cutting, and how do you start? Well, if not cutting, how do you start creating efficiencies and getting the cost of government down? It doesn't look as though there's great opportunity for revenue increasement.
Well, you do what first you bring in a staff ceiling, so public service growth stops, attrition you start to lose staff pretty quickly. People leave, people die, people retire. You quarantine some key areas, if you like. Okay. You've also got to lay down some principles, which the governments, both parties don't seem to know what that word means, about what's the role of government. One reason why the public service is growing is because government is getting involved. I mean, when the Premier talks about providing school lunches, well, who's going to do it? I mean, you're going to have to employ a whole range of people to do that sort of task, which is basically a parental family responsibility to do those sort of tasks, okay? So government's got itself involved, and I've never heard from Christopher Foley any sort of speech about the concept of maybe government's trying to do too much, maybe people are looking to government too much. So governments respond to demand. When people come into the door to a minister's office, they're often asking you to give them something. That's basically what's the game going on. And the hardest word for government to develop is the word no. Okay? No, we're not going to do that thing.
Well, certainly if you haven't gone out and sold that message to the public, I mean, really one of the problems with this small target approach of Christopher Foley's is that he hasn't got the public ready to sort of say, this is the man, because if you go out and you say before an election, if you vote for me, this is what we're going to do. We're going to bring in, never mind the fact that this is actually classical liberal values, is what the party is supposed to stand for. But if he actually was out there saying, look, we're going to create government efficiency and get the debt down, there's going to be a little bit of pain, but we have to do it, and started selling that message beforehand with some courage, then when you get elected, you can say, well, we've got a mandate. But at the moment, he's going to get elected, and he's got a mandate to do absolutely nothing, really, to solve this problem.
Well, look, the model they should be using is the Howard government. 1996, Mr. Howard won a landslide. It was very clear what the Howard government was going to do: cut back public service growth, get the budget back into surplus. It was very clearly stated. He won a landslide election on that basis. He had very clear policies on industrial relations. Everyone knew what John was on about industrial relations and deregulation. And they got the legislation through the Senate with 170 amendments. And then when we went to the GST, 2 years later, he called an early election. We're going to have a GST. We said we weren't going to have one, so we're going to go to an election on that mandate. And he lost 14 seats and almost lost. But we got the GST, which was a great reformer. So that's the difference, I think. This government, do they have a secret list of things they're going to do, or do they have no list at all? Is the sort of the safe, you open the safe up after election, what do we do now? It's empty. We don't know what they're going to do now, and they should be taking. You're right. You've got to bring the people with you. If you don't bring the people with you, you will no longer be a leader. Okay.
Can you win an election in Australia nowadays? Do you think, though, Scott? I mean, this is what the LNP and the Liberal Party people will say. We couldn't win if we went to the electorate and said, we're going to cut the public service. We're going to because the electorate don't understand that. They don't understand the seriousness of the debt problem. They don't even understand the implications of the debt problem, what debt is, or how it all works. Really, a lot of people.
Sure.
So,
but if you
can you win an election with an electorate that's I hate to say it, but a large proportion of them, obviously not the people watching this show, but considerable proportion of people out there don't seem to have that basic fundamental education in economics to understand that sometimes you've got to cut services, otherwise, we could be in real trouble.
I think you can, but you've got to do it over a period of time.
Yeah.
Now, there's many occasions where politicians have had to reverse their previous positions, and they've gone out and gradually convinced the people. What this all shows is that the LNP are not confident that they're capable of mounting the argument, right? And politics is about mounting the argument. People are not economists. We don't want them to be, thank goodness. But if you say to people, do you want your children and grandchildren to be paying this for the rest of their lives? That's what it's all about. And you go out, you could put up a big, signage about, look at all the projects we've wasted on Wellcamp, $100 million, and you have next to that, these are the school rooms we could have built with that
Right.
money?
Yeah.
Are you happy with this arrangement?
Here's how many
And
humidity
most will
cribs,
say
how many
no.
hospital wards, how many nurses we
Yeah.
could have employed.
Wh-
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's the argument? Where's the argument? I mean, we have had in Australia, Keating, Hawke did some great reforms. Um, Howard did as well, as we know, uh, and so forth.
So,
You've got to go out and do the argument. You don't win it overnight. You
no.
win it over a period of time. Now,
So let's say what you said was right, that they're thinking that you suggested that possibly they might have a little secret list of things they're going to do after they get elected. We won't say anything before. We'll go in after it. We'll try and sell it in then. People will say, oh, you don't have a mandate for that, but we'll just do it anyway. If that was the case, maybe to you, Dan, on this one, I mean, first of all, what do you think? Do you think that they have such a list of things they're going to do? Do you think they'll be able to sell that to the Queensland people without an almighty pushback from the union movement, especially if they attempt to make any reduction in the bureaucrats, not the front line, but even making reduction in the bureaucrats in education and health?
Well, I think the electorate actually want change. They're not getting it in terms of the messaging which is coming through this election campaign, but they want change. And they're not convinced about, the idea of fiscal responsibility is manifesting in things where if Stephen Miles can spend $1.4 billion on lunches over 5 years, but have a pretty crappy stadium out at Nathan for the Olympics, there's definitely, I think basically the electorate is really crying out for a much better debate around the economy and around the budget and around the various challenges the state faces. But you've got to be prepared to have it. And I think, to Scott's point, the LNP are almost too scared to kind of say, look, we need to be efficient. We need to have the most efficient, the best performing civil service on the planet. But the thing is, what is being offered is the status quo, and the status quo is not working. If you look at community services, for example, there was the case of Mason Lee, who was let down so badly, that young boy who was killed by his mother's de facto. That was a classic case where no one in the department was reprimanded. The systems and processes were appalling. The bloat and the glut of processes and the cost was shocking. If you were to mount the argument, there's nothing wrong with mounting an argument about wanting to drive efficient outcomes. Many people are small business people. They would welcome this debate. But if it's going to be always distilled down to this, it's the same way manufacturing has become in Australia. If you work in manufacturing, somehow this job you've got in manufacturing of putting something together is far more noble than someone who works in services, for example. It's a really low-based debate, and therefore it's also not happening in the mainstream media. We're seeing that because there's just a lack of understanding of what's really involved. But the word privatisation is a very normal part of a middle tier of government which doesn't raise enough of its own revenue. Asset recycling is a very sensible part of any state government. In fact, Victoria did it not so long ago. And again, they need to do more of it with what they've got. But unfortunately, in their case,
there's not much
they've
left.
gone to the bond. Well, they've gone to the bond market and they've said, right, they've met recurrent expenditure through going to the bond market. Now, the problem with state semis and all that is they are really largely tied and backed by the federal government. I
don't want to get too technical and lose the audience here, but obviously, the bond market's where you go to borrow money. You issue government bonds, and they're called semi-government bonds when they're state. And so those bonds are issued and the money is loaned, and the interest rate is usually handsome. So,
but the thing is, it's an important point because, I remember when Greece went under, their position wasn't terrible 2 years prior to that.
It can happen very quickly, is what you're saying. That they can get very bad.
It can happen very quickly. Now Australia's, if you look at the whole mix, right, of what we do at the moment, beyond these shores and for all sorts, the geopolitical thing does have an impact here. Now we have to be, we don't produce that much. The economy's not that sophisticated, and as difficult as that is for people to hear, it's just a fact. And the only way, if we talk about manufacturing, it's not going to be big mass production manufacturing. It's going to be nuanced, up the higher end of the value chain. That's the conversations you need to be having, but can you do it? And people want that conversation. They're just not getting it here. If it's platitudes, do you know what? The honeymoon will end very quickly for whoever forms government on October 26th.
Yeah, yep. Scott, any thoughts on that?
Well, you're right. Look, because the LNP have not laid out what they really want to do, they don't have laid out the principles of what they stand for. So you can't cover every policy issue before an election because you don't have the information, but you should be laying out these are the principles of our government. Okay, these are the principles of financial restraint, open democracy, a public service that is efficient and so on. It's not politicised, it's not full of your mates and so on. There's a whole stack of things they could have been doing about these things and what we think is the role of government. So I'm quite amazed in my lifetime what government is now doing. I mean, in a country like Australia, people talking about government providing lunches. Are you kidding me at all? Now, most people who go to state schools are not poor. There's some poor, but they're not. Kids at Ashgrove State School are not from poor families.
But we also have
Australia,
systems in place for the poor for providing
That's
lunches
right.
for those who need it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a redundant, crazy policy. I mean, it was really just an election stunt, that one, wasn't it?
It was. And has the LNP opposed it? Has the LNP come out and said, no, that's
They
really a
have.
silly
They,
idea?
but they did, but not forcefully. What they should have really, they should have forcefully said, this is absurd.
Yes,
Parents provide lunch for their children, not the government. The government should
that's
not be
right.
in the home. And this is where, like you have this, and it goes on, and increasingly the idea of 50-cent fares and all this stuff like household budgets. Personal responsibility has to take centre stage here. The government cannot solve society's ills. And unfortunately, this is kind of the beatnik, philosophy that failed so spectacularly in the 70s. Like a lot of these ideas have been tried before and they have failed spectacularly. Really the framework of government is, and for the odd time I wandered into to do various roles in state government roles. The fact of the matter is you need to have a framework which creates the environment to look after your citizens from a health perspective, to protect them from a policing perspective and a community services perspective. And then, of course, there's the education piece. And, those things, they're the bread and butter. But increasingly, the purview of government has become this absurd kind of, they're now the events business. 3 years, they said, we want the Olympics, we'll use existing infrastructure. Well, guess what? We don't have the existing infrastructure. It's old and decayed, according to various reports.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it comes back to the thing we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. He's playing it incredibly safe, excessively safe, I think. Now, let's have a think about whether that could actually backfire. I don't think it's going to backfire in this case and cause them to not win. They're certainly not winning in the sense that they're winning anything. They're really just, the other side's losing. Of course, we've established that, especially with this small target strategy. But given that, maybe people aren't as naive as the LNPs seem to think they are, and they're seeing through the small target strategy. I'm hearing a lot of people saying that they're sick of it. They're sick of this uni party kind of approach, that we don't seem to have an opposition standing up for classical liberal values or for conservative values for people who are a little bit more socially conservative, or for libertarian values for people who want to see more free market economics happening and getting the debt down and reducing the size of government and all those lovely things that the LNP are supposed to stand for. Do you think they might suffer minority government as a result, that we might see the Qatar Australia Party and One Nation capture enough seats to push them into minority? Scott, do you think that's a possibility?
I think we should not rule out the Greens winning quite a few seats. Now, where I'm in the seat of Cooper, which is now the Ashgrove area, I've had 8 brochures from the Greens and 2 door knocks. I've had 6 brochures from the ALP sitting member. I've had no brochures from the LNP, whose candidate was only selected 3 weeks ago, right? So clearly the LNP have given up on what used to be Campbell Newman's seat, and years ago used to be a Liberal seat. So the Greens could win a number of seats. If the Greens win a number of seats and the Katter Party wins more seats than expected up north, they get to 6 seats, then show me how the LNP are going to win the 14 or 15 seats to form a government. Okay?
Is
So
there a
it's
slight
not
possibility, do you think, Scott, that the Greens could win enough seats to carry Labor into a sort of coalition majority?
well, they've got 2 now. If they win Cooper, they win 2 or 3 others. Is that going to happen? Um, that will change the balance quite a bit. And what I think has been very interesting is how the media are picking up all the time. But where's the policy from the LNP on the issue? You're right. The people are questioning that. So I think that the LNP have. I understand them playing it safe when after the last election and getting out and around about the electorates. And I thought Christopher did a good job, step by step. But they're supposed to be the government in waiting. That's what an opposition is supposed to be. They seem to be a government who will wait till they get there till they decide what to do. And that's not good enough at all. It also means their ministers or their shadow ministers are not trained up to have a viewpoint. Okay.
Well, what
So
have they been doing all this
the
time? They've had a
implication is,
long time in opposition.
yeah.
They had plenty of time, plenty of
What the,
practice at being a good opposition.
yeah, the LNP, Liberal non-Labor side of politics, is extraordinarily poor at networking to people who might be interested in supporting them. The ALP have got the unions and the academics and so on, and a lot of professional groups and so on board. The LNP is often by themselves, right? They're not very good at networking and developing those networks to help them do the policy. You can't do the policy just by being a shadow minister going to Parliament. I can tell you right here and
No.
now, it just doesn't work, right? It doesn't work.
No, you've got to map
So
out your stakeholders. You've got to look at every possible community stakeholder, every possible departmental stakeholder, and really listen and talk to people and
that's right.
understand the
And a
issues.
lot of people, are willing to help the non-Labor side of politics, you know, at universities. And I've worked in 5 universities, but they never get rung up. No one ever calls them, right? No one ever calls them to give advice or what do you think of that? They don't seem to know how to do those sort of roles, if you like. So they're
Yep.
not very coordinated in developing policies, and they should be training their people about, to have their arguments, to how to get the arguments. Business people don't do political arguments very good either, right? You saw the Business Council of Australia, to me, finally woke up that maybe the industrial relations arrangements they were ticking off a couple of years ago when Labor got in aren't so good. There's a lot of naivety in the game. They're not playing for keeps. They're not playing, the non-Labor side of politics is not training up and training their people and going out there and fighting the fight, okay? So, look, Margaret Thatcher, when she became leader of the Conservative Party in England, she inherited from Edward Heath. He had that softly approach, work with the unions and that. She said, I'm not going to work with the unions. I'm going to destroy the unions, right? And she was fighting the fight all the time at Conservative Party headquarters during the 1979 election about trying to stop her from saying what you want to do. But she said, I've got to appeal to my base. I've got to appeal to the Conservative base. I've got to have them on side. I've got to show that we are going to implement our basic philosophy in a realistic sort of way.
No, I'm going to play
Tackle
devil's
the
advocate and put it
problems.
to you, Scott. Do you think that if David Crisafulli came out and said he was going to cut the public service, even if he said, I'm just going to cut the bureaucrats, I'm not going to cut any important frontline people, I'm going to take on the unions, I'm going to fight the unions, we're going to... Oh, it actually sounds all right. Actually, now that I say it out loud,
That's pretty good. Keep it up.
he probably would get support.
Yes.
But his, obviously the approach they've taken is the exact opposite of that. And we don't want to get accused of being like Campbell Newman. I mean, I'm sure Campbell must be highly amused at the power he's got and the influence that he's having so many years later on the political environment. It's crazy.
Can I just make a comment about
Please.
Campbell Newman? This is, Campbell Newman was a very popular and highly effective Lord Mayor of Brisbane. In fact, that effectiveness, because, councils do not have the luxury of state budgets. That is, they can't go out and raise billions of dollars of debt. They actually have to be efficient.
Mm.
And I mean, I know people who work in council, and even many of the same people would say, we could probably be a bit more efficient. But generally speaking, council, when Adrian Schrinner, the Brisbane Lord Mayor, said we have to make some savings and we're going to try and ensure that frontline services are all maintained, he trimmed $400 million, and he explained that quite clearly. He was criticised by the Treasurer Cameron Dick, saying, he's lost control of his budget. This is the same guy criticising, has seen a $9 billion blowout, has basically overseen probably the most egregious wage grab in that building, BICPAC, the Best Building Industry Practices Code, which is authored by the CFMEU. Campbell Newman, for all these, for his detractors now, they seem to have this idea that this guy came to the government and was somehow didn't have a history. Campbell Newman was an incredibly successful Lord Mayor of Brisbane, and that is often lost on people. And more sadly for the Liberal National Party, they've chosen to take the Labor line, which is, terrible, terrible. But what was the crux of what he was trying to do? Too quick? Yes, I think he's conceded that was probably a failing of his. But by and large, Queensland's public service debt bill, which we've all been talking about, is 40% of expenditure. You cannot, that is not sustainable. And that's where, this idea where the LNP seems to, that the ghost of Campbell Newman, maybe if they'd actually gone back and said what Campbell Newman was trying to achieve was efficiency in government, were the mistakes made, sure, but we do not resolve from efficiency and valuing the taxpayer dollar. Can anybody? The reason Labor,
well, it would have gotten rid of the ghost of Campbell Newman. It would have said, okay, well, you can't, we're not going to be clouded by that for 3 terms. And what about turning the narrative around and defending, as you just did, his approach and the reasons that he did it? Even if he did concede, well, it was a little bit too hard, too fast. I'm not sure it was. Maybe from a pure stakeholder management perspective it was, but in reality and ethically and morally, perhaps not. Perhaps it needed to happen that fast.
Yeah, but many of these people took redundancies. I mean, this is the thing.
Well, that's right. There wasn't even the sackings that Labor pretended that there were, right?
And this idea that, the industrial relations debate in Australia is always conducted with a backdrop of satanic windmills and children going into pits. It's absurd. By and large, can you imagine the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party, turning on a former leader and trying to distance themselves in such a way that that they're all on board with it, and then when they lost an election, they then quickly scattered. They tend to they treat their former leaders like heroes, probably with the exception of the former Queensland Premier who snubbed their own party's launch, but that's not a party in control. They're in control by the unions, and it's obvious. But
I got a funny feeling that that's a stunt, though, to create a perception of distance between her and Miles, and that they're doing that deliberately. Because
make no mistake, though, when it comes to many Labor people tell me, and they've often told me that they reserve special hatred for their own. And they the personality conflicts within that organisation. They're brilliant at putting on the show of, we're all together.
Well, that's the thing. They are good at putting on the show. They also have to listen to each other because the power bases are strong. Is that the problem with the Conservative side of politics? Because we're very criticised for being way too siloed and always at each other's throats. And everybody wants to be the leader on the Conservative side. Nobody wants to be a team player. Everyone wants to be the saviour.
The only thing they need to do on the Conservative side of politics is actually formulate policy to give up the economic narrative and debate of being a sensible manager of the taxpayer dollar, to not even confront Cameron Dick on the blowouts, on the building construction blowouts, on the fact that the idea that you can just keep raising debt, that you can just have introduced levies when you said you'd introduce no taxes, and that you cannot control that lever of expense to knock back the debate.
Well, it's small target to the point of irresponsibility,
Look,
right? I guess.
it's small target to the you cannot justify. You cannot. There's no credibility in that position.
No, Scott, your
Take
thoughts
the
on?
debate on.
Sorry.
Look, the LNP over the last 9 years could have been running a waste watch campaign, all the waste which is going on. Okay, they just got to pick up the Auditor General reports, and there they are. They've got the parliamentary committee process to locate the waste, and they could be running billboards. This week we wasted $3 million on X. Okay, they could be doing all those things, highlighting how this government has been wasting money. Now, and there's the Olympic Games. Now look at the Olympic Games. 3 years, and we haven't made any progress on that matter. It's not clear what the LNP view is on the Olympic Games. Personally, I'm against the Olympic Games because it's going to cost taxpayers of this state money, right? It's going to cost ratepayers of Brisbane money. But the LNP have been not very good at articulating an alternative policy. You've had the Graham-Quirk report. There's nothing wrong with the Graham-Quirk report. It's a good report. But what people need is for things to be explained to them. The reason why the Greens have done so well is because no one's criticised their policies very much, as if they're basic truths or something.
They're not hard to
Right?
criticise.
Now, in Brisbane, 55% of kids go to private schools, right? 55% in secondary schools go to private schools,
Yep.
right? In most metropolitan areas. The Greens are against private schools. Run a campaign on that. Okay?
Yeah.
All the people at Paddington with the green signs up, where do they send their kids? They send them to Brisbane Grammar or private schools. Let's not kid ourselves. And there's a lot of private schools that are not like Brisbane Grammar School. Okay? That's an exception rather than the rule. So where's the campaign to ridicule and show them up? Okay? Or signs up, we want to do more for homeless. How many people in Paddington want a homeless person living next to them? No one. Okay, it would affect their land values. Where's the fight? Where's the brutality getting into this game of what the fight's about? And Dan's right. We should have been talking about the LNP, about where the party of budget responsibility, where the party wants to get things back, where the party so that we can have budget surpluses to do these things in the future. That's what's not coming across. So when we come to education policy, what's the policy? 6,000 more teachers. The teachers union must say, LNP, we love you, we love you. It's not more teachers we need, it's better teachers, okay? And actually spending more money on education makes almost no difference, okay? So there's no imagination or no willing to articulate. My view is this. The reason why the LNP is this, the non-Labor side of politics, is in this situation is they're not sure what they believe in. And if you're not sure what you believe in, it's very hard to fight for something, right? People fight for causes. The left always have even though different parts of it hate each other, they know what they're fighting for in a sense. The Conservative non-Labor side is a much more wider, broad spectrum, but they're not sure exactly. Are they fighting? Is the LNP fighting just to get into office? Is that it?
Well, it would seem
Right?
that is it, right?
Yeah.
Very much,
Or
yeah.
are they there to address the waste, to fix up the youth crime thing, like a good problem? Housing affordability, how are you going to do it? Now, I've built quite a few houses, right? And I can tell you right here and now, the regulation on houses and the Master Builders Association, Paul Bedell is raising all the issue, all the extra rules and regulations are adding 30% of the cost to the house. It's not just a supply issue, it's how you build a house, what you've got to do. There's a very good thing on the website of the Australian Institute of Progress recently about how you used to be able to build a house. Okay, it's a really, really good point about things. So where's the interesting discussions about these matters? Where have they all been for the last 9 years? They either haven't got the brains or been asleep at the wheel. But you've got to know what you want to fight for. What is a conservative viewpoint? We all know, don't we, that in politics, it's the party which is vive la difference, that win the positions. Malcolm Fraser was different. He had a 6% rating when he became leader of the Liberal Party, and he had the two biggest federal election wins in history. Turnbull almost lost office. He didn't win office. Okay, he just
Yeah.
almost lost it. It's the Conservatives who believe in things, want to do these things, and are different from the other mob that win the electoral appeal and that are most successful. It's not the soft liberals. Look at the soft liberals in South Australia. A great success story, isn't it? Right? I really look at the soft liberals in Victoria. A terrific success story, isn't it? Look at the Tasmanian Liberals, where the stupid premier voted for yes when 75% of his own electorate voted for no on the referendum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
That stuff's
show
astounding.
me. Look, the progressives look, are all fine, and I've worked for them, of course. But you show me where you've been successful, and then I'll sign up. Okay?
Yeah.
But you're not successful. That's the point I'm making all the time.
Yeah. Well, and Western Australia is, another case in point, right? It's just
Mm.
they've just been absolutely annihilated. I just want to share this image of the Queensland Legislative Assembly. It probably is looking fairly unlikely that we're going to not see a majority, I suppose, but it could happen. I mean, it's quite feasible. As you say, there's two Greens there in green. You've got the Independent in grey. The orange is One Nation, and the dark ruby red is the burgundy sort of colour. Those are the three Katter Australia Party members. And then, of course, the Liberal National Party's in blue and the Labor Party in red. Yeah, I mean, it could a hung parliament is not out of the question, Dan. Still, do you think?
To be honest, I think the tea leaves are when the government's on the nose, they're on the nose. And I think to Scott's point, I mean, it's not the Liberal Party winning; it's Labor clearly losing. And the pre-poll, which has been pretty well attended so far, is revealing some pretty strong numbers for the LNP, and I suspect it will be a majority for the LNP.
Okay, and that's been the big change this week, I guess, has been that pre-poll count, and the reports are that it's the swing is very strong against Labor.
Yeah, we criticise the LNP, but in my lifetime, I mean, this ALP, the Palaszczuk government, I have to be honest here, they've been terrible. I mean, they chose the idea was status quo, just keep things going. In that Auditor General's report, I know we keep talking about it, for people viewing this, they go, why does he keep talking about the Auditor General report? These things, the Auditor General focuses on areas of efficiency within government. It would be nice for those who wanting to scrutinise government looked at these reports and championed the causes. Now, here in the state of Queensland, I'll give you one example. There's been reports into the small business and how business works. Here, for example, in the state of Queensland, Coles, Woolworths, major supermarkets all shut at 6 p.m. On a Sunday night. In Sydney, I can go to Coles or Woolworths and it's open till 10 o'clock at night. That's just a classic example of that nighttime economy. I mean, in Sydney, they did a good job of trying to destroy it, but that idea of being able to have a few hours, and then, for example, another absurd thing was all of a sudden there's a thought bubble really from the Grace department was about, oh, you know what, we need to make Christmas Eve a public holiday and put penalty rates on. And so they got the unions to all sign these ridiculous, letters saying, oh, I need it so badly to see my family. What happened was that activity on Christmas Eve fell through the floor. There are so many simple things on the reform side of things which you could champion.
Yep.
But again, it goes back to this point where let's just keep it all quiet. You've got to be able to take people with you like Lee Iacocca did. And if you can't do that, if you want to look at the honeymoon ending very quickly, look at Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom. Came in with a huge majority, and they've forgotten about the Tories very quickly over there. And again, it's revealed that, they want to do something about those terrible private schools over there when it revealed most of the Labor MPs are all wedded to these private schools. It's absurd.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should probably wrap it up, gentlemen. So just final comments. Is this the most boring state election, or one of the most boring state elections that Australians have ever seen? And is there anything that we can do as people, as the community, as the electorate from the outside, to perhaps make these parties, I don't know, or oppositions at least, not play small target games, but actually do their job? Scott, to you first.
Well, I think we need more forums, before the election or in between elections from a wider range of groups. This is the job universities should be doing, but of course they can't. They're incapable of doing it at all. And a lot of people are frustrated with what's going on, and they don't feel that there's any place where they can find out more accurately what's happening. There's a few bodies that try to do these things and get a small number of people to turn up. The interest groups want to keep in good with government, so they don't want to rock the boat too much. They might get themselves blacklisted, if you like. But we need more discussions and things like you're doing, and this station is doing, about these things all the time, so that people get an alternative viewpoint, and also can check what's going on. 3 weeks election campaign is not the way to try and quickly do these things, but there is a yearning out there for being more informed in a sort of fairly neutral sort of way. And I think that's where we should now, with modern communications, be able to do this much, much better. And that's what I think. And the parties themselves should be leading this. They should have been having forums themselves with all sorts of groups to go out to those sort of exercises.
Yeah.
So that's what
we're trying to play our part, and I hope people will share this, especially with friends in Queensland, so that we get at least some discussion and insight and debate going. But we are in a terrible situation, especially in the smaller states outside of New South Wales and Victoria, where most television and most newsrooms and most things are produced. It's really tough to get coverage of state issues these days. The ABC's not doing its job at the state level.
The ABC at 7:30 every night in Brisbane used to have a current affairs show, right? This day and night.
So did Channel 7 and Channel 9.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we don't have that anymore.
No.
So everything's sort of corporatised throughout Australia. The ABC, which is a $1.3 billion enterprise, quite frankly, the management team say you should reinstate your ABC program, okay? ABC radio in Brisbane is pretty fair. TV's not too bad, but we should have a Brisbane, Queensland-based program on Brisbane politics. And my other beef, I'm sorry to explain this, our universities don't hardly teach Australian politics, and they don't teach state politics. State politics is no longer at universities. So they do international relations and sustainability and peace studies and gender studies. We don't study our own state.
Or economics.
And that's what we used to do. We used to have academics talking on, Ken Wiltshire, Peter Coldray.
I remember. Used to have them on the show at 4BC and back in the day. You're a bit closer to the mainstream media career of your past, Dan PETRIE, than I am. What's your take on the state of mainstream media in Queensland at the moment?
Damian, I'm a supporter of yours, obviously, but I think
we're not mainstream.
No, but we're part of an independent movement, which is not formally, doesn't have a head office or anything. But the truth of the matter is the information has to come out. Now, I don't want to be critical of News Corp. I mean, there are many fine people that work there, but often teach in the news academies and all sorts of things, understanding how to extract data from spreadsheets to tell the narrative and the story. That capability gap has been whittled away, really, as most photojournos, if they're talented, they'll get picked up by a government agency. Like the fact that Premier's Department's got 27 odd spinners, and these are good journalists too, but the thing is they can't crack a dollar or they can't turn a dollar in the media landscape. So from the perspective of media, I think, the stuff we're doing, Damian, the stuff we're talking about, that's a good platform, and it's one that, because we're running towards danger, and when you run towards danger, you're different. And I think that's really it's a bit of a slow burn, but the truth of the matter is we're prepared to talk about items and discussions which are not getting captured by the mainstream media, and it's not necessarily their fault. But the thing is, the ABC, for example, of a 7 p.m. news, they can do a few state stories, and the rest of it is what's piped out of Sydney. And the local radio, they do a great job, but even then, they're up against it. So run towards danger, have dangerous ideas, and be prepared to discuss the issues, no matter how challenging they are. Like, we should be able to say that the Greens, for example, the idea that you can cap grocery prices is absurd. But, if there's no one there to contest it, then, that becomes fact and a given.
Indeed. All right, gentlemen, we run a bit longer than I thought we would, but I appreciate you giving us so much of your time. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you both again in the future, not too distant future, I hope. Scott Prasser, Dan PETRIE, thanks for joining us.